"We don't allow street performers here." The words sliced through the elegant murmur of the Jefferson Symphony Hall. The young violinist stood frozen, case clutched against his chest, eyes fixed on the marble floor that probably cost more than everything he owned. Around him, silk dresses rustled, and diamond cufflinks caught the light as the elite of Boston's classical music scene pretended not to stare. The security guard's hand was already on his shoulder, ready to escort him out of a world where talent meant nothing without the right pedigree. The annual Masters Gala was the most exclusive classical event on the East Coast, invitation only, black tie mandatory, and connections essential. Michael had spent 3 months playing on freezing street corners just to afford the second-hand suit he now wore. His hands, calloused from 12 hours of daily practice, trembled slightly as whispers surrounded him. "How did he even get in?" someone murmured. "Security is slipping," replied another. The event organizer, Harrison Wells, approached with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to removing undesirables without causing a scene. "I heard him playing outside," a voice said from the crowd. "I invited him in." The gathering parted as a man in an impeccably tailored tuxedo stepped forward. Several gasps rippled through the crowd as recognition dawned. Leonardo DiCaprio, unexpected guest of the evening, now stood beside the young violinist. "I believe art belongs to those who feel it," DiCaprio continued, his eyes locked with Wells, "not just those who can afford to buy it." The silence that followed would change everything about this night, and one young musician's life forever. Michael Ryan had been playing violin since he was 4 years old, not in prestigious academies or private lessons, but in his grandfather's cramped apartment in South Boston. His grandfather, a former orchestra musician who'd fallen on hard times, had taught him everything he knew before passing away last winter. The violin Michael clutched now had been his grandfather's final gift, along with a promise extracted on his deathbed: "Play where they can hear you. Show them what music really means." Tonight was supposed to be that moment. After weeks of reconnaissance, learning the staff entrance patterns, and saving every penny from street performances, Michael had slipped into the Jefferson Symphony Hall during the catering crew's smoke break. The Masters Gala wasn't just any concert. It was where careers were launched, where the city's most influential patrons selected the musicians they would sponsor for the coming season. One performance, one chance to be heard by people who could change everything. But now, with Harrison Wells' cold eyes dissecting him like a specimen, Michael felt his dream crumbling. The room had gone absolutely silent. Camera phones had emerged from sequined clutches and tailored pockets, surreptitiously recording what was sure to become the social humiliation of the season. Until Leonardo DiCaprio's unexpected intervention changed everything. Harrison Wells's expression hardened as he measured the unexpected complication before him. Wells had built his reputation on exclusivity, on making the Jefferson Symphony Hall the most elite cultural venue in Boston. Street musicians, no matter how talented, were not part of that brand. Yet Leonardo DiCaprio, environmental activist, Oscar winner, and more importantly tonight, a major donor to arts foundations nationwide, had just publicly challenged him. "Mr. DiCaprio," Wells managed with practiced cordiality that failed to reach his eyes, "while we appreciate your democratic appreciation of music, the Masters Gala has a carefully curated program. Our patrons expect a certain standard that—" "That what, Harrison?" A silver-haired woman with impeccable posture stepped forward, opera glasses dangling from a platinum chain. Eleanor Whitmore, the 82-year-old dowager whose family had funded the hall's original construction. A standard that prevents us from hearing something authentic for a change? The crowd's murmuring intensified. Several board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. The young violinist stood motionless, his knuckles white, around his instrument case. This wasn't just about one performance anymore. It had become a very public collision between old money, celebrity influence, and the unspoken rules of high society. Phones continued recording, capturing every nuance of the tension that now filled the opulent reception hall. Leonardo DiCaprio's hand rested lightly on Michael's shoulder, a casual gesture that nonetheless sent a clear message to everyone watching. The actor's face remained pleasant, but his eyes held the same intensity that had commanded screens worldwide. This wasn't a role. This was personal. "I was walking past the Common earlier today," DiCaprio said, addressing the room rather than just Wells. "I heard this young man playing Bach's Chaconne. Not the simplified version, the full, technically impossible piece that most conservatory graduates won't attempt. He was playing it in the snow, for spare change, with more feeling than I heard at the Lincoln Center last month." Michael swallowed hard, staring at his worn shoes. He hadn't noticed anyone stopping longer than usual during his afternoon performance, certainly not someone like DiCaprio. "So yes, Harrison, I invited him in," the actor continued, "because I thought the purpose of the Masters Gala was to celebrate exceptional musical talent, not just exceptional privilege." A few scattered applauses broke out, quickly stifled by disapproving glances. The division in the room was becoming palpable, those intrigued by the disruption versus those offended by it. At the center of it all, Michael remained frozen, his grandfather's violin case clutched to his chest like armor, as the evening that was supposed to be about music became about much more. Harrison Wells forced a tight smile that resembled a grimace more than anything else. 20 years of carefully cultivating the Jefferson Symphony Hall's exclusive reputation was being threatened by a Hollywood actor with liberal ideas and a street musician who didn't know his place. The situation required delicate handling. Alienating DiCaprio would mean losing connections to half of Hollywood's philanthropic circles. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately," Wells suggested, gesturing toward a side door with a manicured hand. "The reception is meant to begin in 15 minutes, and our guests—" "I think we're all quite interested in how this unfolds, Harrison," Eleanor Whitmore interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of old money. "In fact, I'd like to hear this young man play." A collective intake of breath swept through the gathering. Eleanor Whitmore had been the symphony's most generous patron for decades. Her opinion carried more weight than the entire board combined. "Mrs. Whitmore," Wells began cautiously, "our program tonight features Maestro Villeneuve and—" "I've heard Villeneuve play for 30 years, she waved dismissively. "His interpretation hasn't changed since the Cold War ended. I'm curious about something new." Several guests nodded in agreement, emboldened by Whitmore's stance. Michael's eyes darted between the faces surrounding him, his expression a mixture of hope and terror. This moment, this exact moment, was what he had dreamed about for years, yet now that it was happening, his hands trembled violently. Leonardo DiCaprio leaned closer to Michael. "You can walk away if you want," he said quietly. His words meant only for the young musician. "No one would blame you. Or you can play like you did in the park, like no one's watching, like it's just you and the music." The room waited, breaths held, phones recording what was quickly becoming one of the most unusual moments in the gala's storied history. The division among the guests grew more pronounced, some eager to witness what would happen next, others scowling at the breakdown of tradition and protocol. Michael took a deep breath and slowly opened his violin case. The instrument inside wasn't a Stradivarius or a Guarneri. It was a moderately good violin that had been lovingly maintained for decades. As he lifted it out, several connoisseurs in the crowd visibly winced at the sight of the worn instrument. One woman in diamonds whispered audibly to her companion, "This should be interesting," with the practiced sarcasm of someone who had already decided what she would hear. "What will you play?" Eleanor Whitmore asked, her eyes sharp despite her advanced age. Michael hesitated only a moment. "Paganini's Caprice No. 24, he answered, his voice steadier than he felt. A murmur ran through the crowd. It was one of the most technically challenging violin pieces ever composed, the Mount Everest of solo violin performance. Harrison Wells couldn't suppress a smirk. An ambitious choice, he said, the implication clear. This street performer was about to humiliate himself attempting a piece that had broken professional careers. DiCaprio caught the expression and stepped forward. "I'd like to make a proposal," he said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had made him a household name. "If this young man meets your standards, your honest musical standards, he plays tonight as part of the program." The crowd's reaction was immediate and divided. Several board members began protesting simultaneously, while others nodded in approval. Wells's face flushed crimson. "And if he doesn't?" Wells demanded, regaining his composure. DiCaprio looked directly at Michael before answering. "Then I'll personally apologize for the interruption and double my planned donation to the symphony's educational fund." The strategic brilliance of the offer wasn't lost on anyone. Wells couldn't refuse without appearing petty and risking a substantial donation. For Michael, the stakes had just grown exponentially. It was no longer about being heard, it was about proving that art transcended the boundaries society placed around it. His hands steadied as he raised the violin to his chin and positioned the bow. The first note hung in the air like a challenge. Michael's bow moved across the strings with a precision that immediately silenced the skeptics. Paganini's 24th Caprice began with a theme, deceptively simple yet demanding perfect intonation, before launching into variations that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible on a violin. By the third variation, the room had fallen completely silent. The rapid arpeggios flowed from Michael's fingers with a fluidity that professionals spent decades trying to achieve. His technique was unorthodox, clearly self-taught in places, but his command of the instrument was undeniable. What truly captivated the audience, however, wasn't his technique, but the raw emotion he poured into each phrase. Leonardo DiCaprio watched the faces around him transform. The woman who had whispered the sarcastic comment now stood transfixed, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand. Eleanor Whitmore had closed her eyes, an expression of pure contentment softening her aristocratic features. Even several of the board members who had most strongly objected were now watching with reluctant admiration. Only Harrison Wells remained unmoved, his expression calculating, as he assessed the changing dynamics in the room. This performance threatened everything he had built: the careful curation of talent, the exclusive access, the artificial scarcity that kept donors paying premium prices. If talent could walk in off the street and command this kind of attention, what was the purpose of his elaborate gatekeeping? As Michael approached the most technically demanding variation, a section that required the violinist to play continuous four-note chords with perfect intonation, Wells stepped subtly toward the light switch panel near the wall. The movement caught DiCaprio's attention, who watched with narrowed eyes as the event organizer's finger hovered near the controls. The actor moved casually in the same direction, positioning himself between Wells and the switches as Michael's playing reached its most impressive heights. The silent power struggle between the two men continued as the music soared to its climax, the young violinist oblivious to anything beyond his grandfather's violin and the legacy he was honoring with every note. The final notes of Paganini's Caprice reverberated through the hall, suspended in the air for a breathless moment before they faded to silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The absence of immediate applause, that social reflex ingrained in concert attendees, spoke volumes about the impact of what they had just witnessed. It wasn't that they hadn't enjoyed it, it was that they were still processing what they had heard. Michael lowered his violin slowly, his eyes gradually refocusing on the room around him. During the performance, he had disappeared into that sacred space where only the musician and music exist. Now, faced with the sea of stunned expressions, reality came crashing back. His hands began to tremble again. The silence stretched for 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then Eleanor Whitmore raised her hands and began to applaud. The sound was jarring in the silence, but it broke the spell. Within seconds, the room erupted in applause, hesitant at first, then growing in enthusiasm until it reached a thunderous level. Several people rose to their feet, including 3 members of the symphony board. Leonardo DiCaprio's face broke into a genuine smile as he joined the ovation, his eyes never leaving Harrison Wells, who remained rigid with his hands at his sides. The event organizer's face had become a careful mask, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed his internal conflict. "Well, Harrison," DiCaprio's voice somehow carried over the applause. "I believe we had an agreement." Wells stepped forward, professional smile firmly in place. The crowd quieted, sensing another pivotal moment in the evening's unusual drama. Wells reached out his hand toward Michael, who hesitantly extended his own, still holding his bow. "Technically impressive," Wells acknowledged with a nod that managed to be both gracious and condescending. "But I'm afraid technique alone doesn't—" "Oh, for heaven's sake, Harrison!" Eleanor Whitmore interrupted, her aristocratic patience clearly exhausted. "That was the most genuine musical performance I've heard in this hall in a decade." The room buzzed with tension as Harrison Wells found himself cornered. He had spent decades curating not just musical performances, but the social hierarchy that surrounded them. Now, both were being challenged publicly, with dozens of phones capturing every moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," Wells said, his voice professionally controlled, despite the visible vein pulsing at his temple. "While I appreciate your enthusiasm, the Masters Gala program has been finalized for months. We simply cannot—" "You promised," DiCaprio cut in, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of certainty. "In front of everyone here, if he met your standards, your honest musical standards, he would play tonight." Wells's smile tightened further. "Mr. DiCaprio, with all due respect, you're an actor, not a musical director. The nuances of classical performance—" "Are exactly what we just witnessed," came a new voice. Maestro Villeneuve, the evening's featured performer, had emerged from the side entrance where he had apparently been listening. The distinguished conductor moved with deliberate steps toward Michael, his expression inscrutable. The crowd parted instantly, murmurs of surprise rippling through the gathering. Villeneuve stood before Michael, examining him with the intensity of someone who had spent 60 years evaluating musical talent. Michael straightened his posture instinctively, holding the older man's gaze despite his thundering heart. "You play with passion," Villeneuve said, his Russian accent still thick despite decades in America. "Technical imperfections, yes, but passion that cannot be taught." He turned to Wells. "I will share my stage tonight." The pronouncement landed like a thunderclap. Harrison Wells' composure finally cracked, his face flushing deep crimson. "Maestro, this is highly irregular." "As is your attempt to deny what we all heard," Villeneuve replied, unmoved. He turned back to Michael. "Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto, final movement. You know it." Michael nodded, unable to speak, barely believing what was happening. "Good," Villeneuve said with finality. "We play together tonight." The moment Maestro Villeneuve's words registered throughout the room, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere. Board members exchanged glances, donors whispered urgently to one another, and several prominent music critics who had been silently observing reached for their phones, fingers flying across screens to update their evening's coverage. This wasn't just an unexpected program change. It was a story that would reverberate through Boston's cultural landscape for years. Harrison Wells stood motionless, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. 20 years of selective exclusion, of measuring value by pedigree rather than talent, challenged by a street musician and legitimized by the very artists Wells claimed to champion. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. "This is absurd," Wells finally managed, his composure slipping. "He hasn't rehearsed with the orchestra. The program is set. Our subscribers—" "We'll witness something authentic," Leonardo DiCaprio interjected, no longer bothering to hide his contempt for Wells. "Isn't that what art is supposed to be?" Phones captured Wells' expression as he struggled between professional obligation and personal pride. His gaze swept the room, searching for allies, but found only curiosity or outright support for the unexpected development. Even his most reliable board members appeared intrigued by the possibility of what might unfold. Michael stood at the center of this storm, clutching his grandfather's violin, eyes wide with disbelief. His journey from playing for spare change in the Boston Common to sharing a stage with Maestro Villeneuve had taken less than an hour. The weight of the moment, its improbability, its perfection, settled on his shoulders. "I won't let you down," he said quietly to Villeneuve. The renowned conductor's stern expression softened momentarily. "Music is not about letting down or lifting up," he said. "It is about truth. Play your truth, and nothing else matters." Eleanor Whitmore approached, her aristocratic authority parting the crowd. "It seems we have a change to tonight's program," she announced, her voice carrying decades of unquestioned authority. And I, for one, couldn't be more delighted. 3 hours later, the Jefferson Symphony Hall erupted in the kind of standing ovation rarely seen in classical venues. The performance of Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto had transcended mere music. It had become a statement. Michael stood center stage beside Maestro Villeneuve, sweat glistening on his forehead, his grandfather's violin still warm in his hands. The orchestra members behind him were applauding too, tapping their bows against their stands in the traditional sign of musical respect. In the front row, Leonardo DiCaprio stood alongside Eleanor Whitmore, both visibly moved by what they had witnessed. Even the most skeptical critics were on their feet. The only absence was notable. Harrison Wells had remained backstage for the entire performance, his formal resignation from the symphony board already drafted on his phone. Michael's eyes searched the crowd until he found what he was looking for, a group of young musicians from his neighborhood who had been hastily ushered in before the performance began, DiCaprio's doing. Their faces reflected something beyond admiration, possibility. The walls that had seemed so impenetrable just hours ago had been proven permeable after all. As he took his final bow, Michael whispered a silent thank you to his grandfather, whose belief had carried him to this impossible moment. The reception that followed buzzed with an energy rarely felt in the traditionally subdued symphony hall. Music critics huddled in corners, revising their reviews on tablets. Board members who had initially opposed Michael's performance now claimed they had recognized his talent immediately. Social media was already exploding with clips of both the confrontation and the performance, #StreetToSymphony, trending across platforms. Michael found himself surrounded by people who had ignored him for years when he played on street corners. Business cards appeared from record label representatives, conservatory directors, suddenly found scholarship opportunities, and wealthy donors offered to discover his talent, as if it hadn't been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged rather than created. Through it all, Michael maintained a quiet dignity that impressed DiCaprio more than his playing had. When a prominent music producer suggested Michael should polish his image to better fit the classical world, the young violinist simply replied, "My grandfather taught me that music isn't about fitting in, it's about standing out by being true." Eleanor Whitmore overheard the exchange and smiled approvingly. She approached Michael with purpose, her aristocratic bearing commanding space even in the crowded room. "Young man," she said, holding out her hand, "I believe we need to discuss your future. The symphony could use some authentic passion." 2 weeks later, Leonardo DiCaprio sat in his hotel suite reviewing his social media accounts, something he rarely did personally. The story of Michael Ryan had indeed gone viral, with over 8 million views across platforms. More importantly, it had sparked a nationwide conversation about access to the arts, talent versus privilege, and the invisible barriers that kept so many voices from being heard. The symphony had announced a new open stage initiative, funded jointly by DiCaprio and Eleanor Whitmore, dedicated to finding exceptional talent from unconventional backgrounds. Harrison Wells had resigned from his position, citing creative differences with the board's new direction. Maestro Villeneuve had taken Michael under his wing as a special protégé, working to refine his natural talent without diminishing his unique approach. Most significantly, applications from underprivileged neighborhoods to music education programs had increased by over 300% in just 2 weeks. Parents were bringing children to symphony performances who had never before considered classical music for them. DiCaprio closed his laptop with satisfaction. His industry often criticized celebrity involvement in causes as mere publicity stunts, but moments like this proved otherwise. Sometimes change needed a catalyst, someone to stand in the gap between what was and what could be. In Boston Common that afternoon, young musicians gathered around Michael as he taught them the opening bars of Paganini's Caprice number 24. The circle of possibility widened with each note.